Okay, so we talked a little bit about different kinds of hunts, whether you're hunting for commerce and fur or whether you're hunting as a social thing. There's other ways of hunting as well. There was sort of the really machismo way, which I'll talk about in a moment, but there was also hunting pests effectively. So we didn't sort of see them in the late Middle Ages in England, but wolves were all around Europe. The last one, sort of late 13th century or so, we think was when they became extinct in the UK. But wolves were a real danger during the period. They would attack livestock and sheep. They would be damaging to other kinds of animals. So if you were trying to sort of manage your land and these wolves were coming in and attacking your livestock or attacking horses or anything else, so they would go off and hunt these. Now, we talked about the nobility of animals. There were broadly three animals that were kind of considered as noble prey in the medieval period, at least in England. This was the boar, for its power, sheer power. The deer, for its noble character. Oddly, another one was the hare. So the sort of the relative of the rabbit. It was seen as a really, really cunning animal. It was very fast. It would disappear down holes, it would come back in other ways. There's a huge sort of thing I could go into around the topsy-turvy world, the world turned on its head. So you look at lots of medieval manuscripts and you have hares on medieval manuscripts. Sometimes they're riding snails and jousting, sometimes they're running after men with clubs and beating them. So there was a weird kind of thing with hares in the medieval period, and they were very wily, they would turn the world on its head. They were very clever, very tricky kind of animals. But the animal that was hunted, like the wolf, was seen as a very low animal. It had no respect. It wasn't something that you would hunt in that way that you would with a deer and the boar with pageantry. It was seen as a low animal, full of cunning, and it was related to thievery, viciousness, and it was seen very much as something to be eradicated, something to be hunted out of the land. And it was. As I say, by the 14th century there were no wolves left in England, we think. And the way that they would do this was very similar to the hunt by force. They would chase the animal down, and you would use this in teams. You would use hunters to try and find the trail, find the den possibly, and then you would hunt the animal. The difference being is you weren't fussed about how you necessarily killed it. You weren't trying to drive it into a hunting line, you just wanted the animal dead. So this time you might send in the dogs to do the killing. These would be large, very large dogs. So there's a breed of dog called a wolfhound. This is exactly what it was for. It was for hunting wolves. But the problem is wolves are very aggressive and they can attack back. And what they tend to do is go for the throat of the animal that's attacking them. And dogs, being bred, kind of self-domesticating from wolves, don't have the same viciousness. They don't have the same length of teeth, the power in the jaw. So they were disadvantaged against the wolf. So what hunters did was to try and give some advantage back to the dogs. So when they were hunting, a lot of the dogs were equipped with collars like this. So this collar, leather with a buckle on, was strapped around the throat of your dog. And the idea being that as the wolf went in to try and grab the throat of the dog, it would get a mouthful of nails, mouthful of spikes. And this would obviously stop the wolf attacking your dogs, and stop the dogs taking quite so much harm. And the dogs would go in and they would attack and they would kill the wolf. But you would still have casualties. You might still lose some dogs, and it was still a very hard way of attacking it. So another way that you could work to try and kill any wolves in your land was by trapping them. So this was something that was done a little bit more by the common level of society. So they would set some very appalling traps appalling by 21st century standards, by animal rights now. They would use poisoned meat that they would leave and bait it so that the wolf would eat it and die. They would have chunks of meat left as bait with hooks inside of them, so the wolf would eat it and then the hooks would get stuck inside and kill the wolf internally. A very nasty way to die. They would set traps, so they would hang some meat off a weighted cantilevered bar. The meat would have a hook in it. The wolf would jump up and grab it. It would pull it down, and then it couldn't get away. The hook would seize in the animal and it would be hung there and it would die. There are other traps as well. They would have pitfall traps. So you set up fences, very wide fences that get narrower and narrower and narrower, and you would bait it with meat. the wolf would go into this narrowing gap. It would go for the last piece of meat, the bait, and it would fall through into a pit trap full of spikes. So there was no respect for the wolf. It was not seen as something noble to be hunted. It was seen as vermin. It was seen as pest. It was seen as a threat to be eradicated. So a very, very different way of hunting. Now, we do know that wolf pelts were very, very expensive as well. They were incredibly warm. They were used extensively in the colder climes to line coats, to line hoods. So they did still trade the result of the hunt, but there was no pageantry around it. Now, another animal that was hunted, again in parts of Europe rather than the UK really, was the bear. So this was the absolute pinnacle of insanity hunting. These were enormous creatures, incredibly powerful. They would swat away dog teams. They couldn't be felled easily by a single arrow. To be attacking them with a boar spear, you would be incredibly brave and probably putting your life in very, very much at risk. But people still did go out and hunt them. And it's another indication as to the social aspect of it. There was no need to hunt bears. They stayed relatively to themselves. They were isolated animals. They didn't attack livestock. They didn't cause any damage to fields or anything else. They were purely hunted to show off how good a hunter you are, how brave you are, how strong you are, how insane you are to go and throw yourself against a bear. And it's another indication how pervasive hunting was in the medieval world. They would hunt everything from shrews, the tiny little animals, right through to bears and everything in between. Hunting was a really, really important part of the medieval lifestyle, the medieval mindset. One of the other things that we're going by, I haven't really touched on yet, is falconry or hawking. This is very much reserved to the upper classes. So the way that you would do this, there's two ways to hunt, broadly speaking, with a falcon or a hawk, and the falconry and hawking are slightly different things, but we'll not go into the sort of the details of that. It gets into quite complex levels. We'll just talk about using birds of prey. So there's one way you can hunt from the fist. So this is why I'm putting on the glove. Unfortunately, I haven't got a hunting bird with me, but what you would do is you would train your animal to sit on your hunting glove, and you would go out into the fields, into the countryside on horseback, and you would go out hunting where you think animals would be. The hawk would probably be hooded until you were ready to hunt. It would be very well trained. It would be at its flight weight, so it can't be too well fed, or else it won't be able to fly. It can't be too hungry, or else it won't have the energy to do so. So the thing with keeping a hawk ready for hunting is a real balancing act of getting it just at the right weight, just at the right level, that it's actually going to do the job and come back afterwards, instead of just sitting on your hand or flying off, going back into the wild. The people who say that you can't ever really domesticate a hawk, I think you can train it, but you can't necessarily domesticate it the same way that you might do a dog. But what you're doing is hunting from the fist. So the hawk is on your hand. You see an animal in the distance and you loose the hawk. You effectively almost throw it off your fist, and it launches off and it goes in and it swoops down and it grabs the animal. It then brings its wings over the animal, trying to sort of keep it covered because it's its kill, and then you go in, retrieve the hawk and retrieve the animal. And this is one way that you can do for hunting for fur, but generally it was seen as very much a sport. Again, we've got into something called the sumptuary laws. Different levels of society were allowed to have different hawks. Now there's dispute over these laws, whether they were actually enforced, whether people sort of broke them just to show how much money they had because they could afford to pay the fines, but they were in written accounts, so argument over them, but they were there. And if you were the king, you were allowed an eagle. If you were a prince, if you were a knight, you were allowed different animals. Now technically, if you were part of the church, you shouldn't be hunting with birds, but there are accounts of the ecclesiarchy, the church, trading in birds, sending these birds across the seas. Huge amounts of money would change hands buying these birds from overseas, buying them from certain places where they were trained very well, where they were bred very well. And you could breed, or you could train the animal from a chick, or you could catch one wild, and this was again different sort of subtleties in the way that you go hawking. The other way you can launch or hunt with a bird is from the tower, and that's doing it from height. So this is where the bird is already circling above. It has a huge range of vision, has a huge ability to scan in a large area, and it will look for prey. It will swoop down. It might go for other pheasants and other birds. So you might be using this with beaters who send up pheasant or partridge into the air, and then the bird comes down and grabs them. It will knock the animal out of the sky. It might kill it in that process, and it will fall to the floor. And then you send in dogs, especially trained retriever dogs, to go in and get the animal with soft mouths so that they don't mark the bird and don't do any damage to it. So different ways you can launch from the tower, you can launch from the fist. There is a huge amount of information around hawking. It's something that's been done all around the world and still goes on today. So this is just kind of touching into the basics of it. If you're really interested, there is a massive amount of information out there to go learn a little bit more of it. But that's just giving you a taster of it. So there's a few different animals again there that you can look at. We'll go into a couple more in another video in a moment.